for coming out. We are very happy to have David Lewis, Executive Director of Save the Bay, who has been working in this organization for upwards of 2 decades, and is here to talk to us about some really exciting climate adaptation work that him and his organization are doing. The infrastructure in San Francisco Bay, which I'm sure he'll talk about, is it's incredible, the range of challenges. First of all, it's all the Silicon Valley firms, and then it's the airport, and it's just an incredible challenge, and both environmentally and economically. So really interested to see what he's been up to. And David, we have a lot of students here who are looking to get into kind of climate adaptation work. So anything more towards the end, if you could steer to tips for them on what's needed in this field and how they can get involved, would be greatly appreciated. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks. Nice to be here. Just get out of the Bay Area to the other Bay Area every once in a while. And thanks for inviting me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and tell you about a particularly significant project that I have been working on for 13 years. Everybody else thinks it's been 10, but good things take a long time. I'm going to touch on geography and habitat and sea level rise and adaptation and planning. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really politics. So I hope that's not unwelcome. And if it is, too bad. When we get to the question and answer session, if you don't want to talk about politics, you can ask me about other things. My favorite thing is to get a question I've never gotten before. So you can think about that. Just a little bit of background about myself. Born and raised on the peninsula in Palo Alto. Went back east to college, ended up in Washington, D.C., working for about 15 years on nuclear arms control for advocacy organizations, lobbying on off the Hill, grassroots organizing, and then for in the U.S. Senate for about 5 years for a Senator on the Armed Services Committee. And then started a family, came back to the Bay Area, and was fortunate enough to get this job at Save the Bay as the executive director. So I'll tell you a little bit about Save the Bay and who Save the Bay is. Save the Bay is actually as old as I am. It's really the first grassroots environmental organization, advocacy organization, started in the early 60s to prevent the Bay from being filled in. It's actually started by 3 women who were living in the Berkeley Hills, seeing the bay disappear because most of the bay is shallow and it was being destroyed. They started organizing their friends and had amazing success. In just 4 years, got the state to place a moratorium on filling in the bay for development and create the first coastal zone management agency. You all know about the Coastal Commission. This was the Bay Commission that was actually created before the Coastal Commission for the Bay, and the Coastal Commission was modeled on that. And Save the Bay has gone on to do a lot of other important work, which I won't spend too much time talking about tonight. But if you want to ask me questions afterwards. Second thing I'm going to do is take off my jacket, because you guys have obviously been in this room for a while, working out. It's warmer, I'll take off my tie. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? I think you can. All right. So in June of this year, the San Francisco Bay Area voters approved a new region-wide tax in all 9 counties in San Francisco Bay. Over the next 20 years, that tax is going to create a Tidal Marsh restoration fund of $500 million for restoring Tidal Marsh in San Francisco Bay. And the approval of that tax by 70% of the voters in all 9 Bay Area counties together in the Bay Area, which exceeded the 2/3 margin needed for passage, that was the culmination of a decade-long effort in planning, organizing, and execution by a really broad coalition led by Save the Bay. Tell you a little bit, first of all, about the background of the opportunity to restore Tidal Marsh in San Francisco Bay. here is the bay from space, from satellite. And it's pretty easy to see how much of the Bay Area has been urbanized because you can see it all in gray. But I will point out to you that down here in the South Bay, you see these surprising colors. These are salt evaporation ponds. We'll get into why they're different colors later. And in the far North Bay, you can see some other areas that are green and multicolored. And these are areas around the shoreline that have not been paved over, and where tidal marsh restoration is possible. Now, in fact, more than a third of San Francisco Bay was diked off, separated from tidal action, mostly in the 50 years after the gold rush. And there was previously about 200,000 acres of tidal marsh before the gold rush, before 1850. And so some of these areas that were diked off were actually paved over, filled in, built on. Any of you been to Oakland Airport, that's all on landfill. San Francisco Airport, it's all on landfill. And lots of areas around the shorelines that are reducing the tidally active size of the bay by a third by the early 1960s. But there were some areas that were not paved over, that were diked. The salt evaporation ponds that I pointed out in the south, some areas were originally diked for hay fields. They wanted to grow other agriculture, but the soil was very alkaline. They figured they could grow things, and they turned out they couldn't. They could only grow hay. That was actually a cash crop because San Francisco was running on horses. They needed hay to feed the horses. As we transferred our major transportation and work infrastructure away from horses, hay was not a particularly valuable crop, but those areas were diked over. So starting about 2 decades ago, people realized that these areas that had been diked off but not paved over could potentially be restored to tidal marsh, and that would actually be a very valuable thing to do for the ecosystem of San Francisco Bay, primarily because it would increase habitat for endangered species. 2 of the endangered species that only live in San Francisco Bay tidal marsh, salt marsh harvest mouse on the bottom, which is about the size of your thumb, and now the Ridgway's rail. It used to be called the Clapper rail until a couple of years ago. So this opportunity to restore some of these areas to tidal marsh started gaining public support. And then in 1999, it was backed by a really strong scientific consensus. This study, the habitat goals, to look at what habitat could be recreated in San Francisco Bay and expanded, and which species specifically would benefit from that. So that scientific consensus has been updated and reaffirmed several times. And here's the main thing that it found. So here's the 200,000 acres of tidal marsh before the gold rush. Here's how little of it was left after all that development by the late 90s. Some areas diked off, but not paved over, but not very much tidal marsh, actually down to about 40,000 acres of existing tidal marsh. And then that 1999 study and subsequent ones found that we could get back to 100,000 acres. So add 60,000 acres more of tidal marsh, get back to 100,000, and that study actually showed where that could be done, where the sites were to do that. This is what tidal marsh restoration looks like in a salt pond. So this area was diked off and water was put in it over 100 years and evaporated to eventually crystallize salt. But the basic topography of the pond wasn't changed. These tidal channels, the historic channels, were still there. But the tides weren't coming in each day. After restoration, the tides, levees are breached, tides bring in mud and silt and some of the basic plant seeds, and the marsh revegetates, and then it's very fertile habitat, actually one of the most biologically rich habitats on the planet. So some of this work started to be done, very dramatic results, birds coming back, fish coming back, shark populations in the bay increasing. So looked very promising. Some parts of the bay that were diked off, they were subsided, because when you take spongy, wet soils, and you dry them out over a long period of time, they get packed. Very difficult to get them to expand again. This is Hamilton Airfield, an Army airfield in Marin, in Novato. Originally, this area was diked for a hayfield, then they eventually built a military airfield on it, then they built a big long runway. So when it was subsided, in this case 10 feet below sea level, if we just let the tides back in, it would be an empty pond. It's not the right level for tidal marsh to form. So in this case, and in several other cases, we bring in dredge material, sand and silt from dredging navigation channels to keep them open in the bay, get it to the right level, then let the tides in, and now it's wet and starting to revegetate. This area was reconnected to the tides 3 years ago. So in some cases, it takes a little more work to get it going. But the other thing that you have to do, because you can't see in this photo, but there's actually a housing development right next to this, which is also 7 feet below sea level. If you're going to make a dry area wet again with the tides, you need to build a new levee to protect adjacent infrastructure. We'll come back to that. Okay, so that's the basic background on what tidal marsh restoration means, why there's an opportunity in the Bay Area. Overall, the pace of restoration to get to this 100,000 acres has been slower, even though much of the areas that could be restored were reacquired. The salt ponds were bought back by the federal government, a lot of them in 2003, and some of the other areas that were privately owned were bought back and put back in public ownership for the purpose of being restored. But the restoration is moving slower, and the main reason is money. The missing ingredient was money, and the main cost, there's some cost in planning and permitting these projects, but the main cost is building those levees to protect homes, businesses, roads, railroads, anything that's adjacent to the area where you want to reconnect the tides. So this whole effort gained some additional urgency as people started to realize that sea levels were rising, and that was going to make this work difficult. So there was an update of that scientific study in 2015 that established not only was this still ecologically important, it's actually more urgent. Because existing tidal marshes can adjust to changes in sea level. If there's enough sediment in the surrounding water, they can accrete sediment, and if the sea level rise doesn't happen too quickly, they can actually adjust their elevation. But if you wait too long, then you have that problem that you had at Hamilton Field, because then there's a gap between where the property is that you want to restore is too low to get tidal marsh to form. So the more we can get these areas restarted sooner, the better. So the Bay Area, unusual in the world, really had several basic ingredients for large-scale marsh restoration. We had scientific and agency consensus on the goal, established scientific plans to support accelerating marsh restoration. We had examples of successful project implementation, so this wasn't just an idea. It had been demonstrated that it could work and bring ecological benefits. We had the property available, we had the sites back in public ownership, mostly by wildlife and resource agencies, to conduct this restoration in a landscape scale. There were some small sites, but mostly these are pretty big areas. And maybe most importantly, we had a really strong public consensus. This is a very environmentally sensitive population in the Bay Area, pretty progressive. People like the Bay, even if only for aesthetic reasons. That public affection, pretty important for getting broad support for something. So the opportunity and the challenge was appreciated by some leaders, civic leaders, agency leaders, and a few advocates, mostly us, but also some other environmental advocates. I would say as early as 2004, after the available area that was in public ownership was increased with a large government purchase back of these salt ponds. But the funding gap and the strategy for how to close that funding gap were really first articulated in a public way by us, by Save the Bay, in 2007. So we did a study to quantify how much money, how much of a gap there really was. And you don't need to read the fine print here, but this is a list of all the sites that had been acquired where tidal marsh could be restored. how much money had already been spent to acquire them, what it would cost to restore them, and we didn't develop new estimates, we just added all the agencies that own these sites, added up, and I'll spare you squinting, it says $1.4 billion. This is the cost to restore the tidal marsh, build the adjacent levees, maintain those levees, monitor the work over 50 years. 50 years of operations and maintenance costs in addition to the initial cost. And that would restore, the estimate was that would restore 36,000 acres. These properties add up to 36,000 acres on top of the 40 or so that existed. Get to about 76, closer to 80. Still need to acquire 20,000 acres more someplace and restore them to get to 100,000 acres, but we would be basically doubling the tidal marsh in San Francisco Bay with all the benefits that we get from that. So what do you think people's reaction was to this? Actually really positive for most people, except for my friends in the environmental communities. Don't tell them what it'll cost. People will be scared, sticker shock. We'll never be able to get the dribs and drabs of money that we're getting for this right now because it'll look so expensive. Which of course is ridiculous. There's no credible way to ask for large sums of money without justifying what you need. Most of the money that had been spent to that point for this work was from state resource bonds and a little bit of federal money, even though most of this is on federal land, was mostly not being paid for by the federal government. So at the same time as we calculated this total, we also did some public opinion research, and we found that if we asked the question in a general way, about 75% of voters in the Bay Area said, I would pay about $10 a year to help raise the money to do this. We recommended that, based on that, we should try to create a source of funding from the Bay Area to pay for some of this work, and also get more state funding, and also get more federal funding, because the Bay doesn't get it nearly enough. But we actually got a pretty broad set of endorsements for this report and for the recommendations to do this. People like Senator Feinstein, some of the business leaders, and they saw that cost as a worthwhile investment, especially if local voters were going to pay for it, and Senator Feinstein didn't have to get more money from the federal government. But how to make this happen? How to secure a new source of local funding from the Bay Area? The political geography of the Bay Area makes this very challenging. We have 9 counties and 100 cities, and lots of other agencies. All 9 counties have some of the Bay shoreline in them. California's laws set a really high bar for raising local taxes after Prop 13. Very difficult to raise local money without a supermajority of 2/3. The one existing regional agency with a mandate to work on the Bay, protect the Bay, and permit the Bay, which I mentioned at the beginning, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, it actually has a pretty narrow mandate, and it doesn't have any taxing authority. So with no existing way to collect funding from people who said they would be willing to pay some of it, we looked to create one. We basically made this recommendation to ourselves, and then we spent the last decade trying to act on it. So first we looked at creating what's called a joint powers agreement. You take existing government entities, they sign a memorandum of understanding, and they agree to do something together. Could be something as simple as operating a sports field, or as complicated as getting fresh water to a large region. That looked like a really bad way to go about it. They're very complex, fragile. Basically, it's like a Security Council. One party can veto what the majority of the other parties want to do if it comes to that. We looked at giving an existing agency, like the State Coastal Conservancy, that does restore coastal habitat, giving them the authority to propose a local tax. But the state government was not excited about that. Then Governor Schwarzenegger and the Resources Agency, they liked to raise money that the state would control, not do this. So we decided that we needed to create a new government entity, which is about the least popular thing you can usually do, because, as I just said, there are already a lot of government entities. Why do we need another one? So we decided to create a regional special district with a very narrow mandate, we actually gave it the mandate to propose taxes for Tidal Marsh restoration. And if the voters said yes, then it would have the mandate to spend that money on grants to projects to restore Tidal Marsh. So there is a hard way to establish a new government agency. It's called LAFCO, Local Area Formation Commission, and it takes a really long time. It's very easy for a minority to stop it. Or you can go to the state legislature and have them create a special district that is then not a state agency. And a lot of water districts in the region are like that. So we did. We sponsored a bill. We got a broad coalition of supporters. We got it passed in the legislature and signed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2008 to create the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. It's a regional special district. It covers the 9 Bay Area counties. It has that narrow mandate that I mentioned. It has a governing board of 7 elected officials who are not elected to that governing board. They're appointed to that governing board by another government agency, the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is our local council of governments. So, over the next 6 years after this was created, the authority spent a lot of time thinking about how to propose a tax, when to propose a tax, whether to propose a tax, and just all the details of how to do that. Well, to get this thing passed by the state legislature, it had to not cost the state anything. So we created this entity, but it had no staff, it had no resources, it had no money. We donated our staff time, some other people donated their staff time. We raised a little bit of money to do some public opinion polling and paid for some other incidentals, legal research mostly, to explore some scenarios. And here are the basic questions that the authority spent the last 6 years thinking about. Where to propose a tax? They had the authority to propose it in all 9 Bay Area counties, but the politics in different counties and the population is pretty different. You know, those counties have areas that are close to the bay and far from the bay. So who should we ask to pay a tax? Our polling showed slightly higher support in communities that live closer to the bay, but bay polls differently than a lot of other things. And people living in Walnut Creek or Clayton actually had similar levels of support as people who were living right on the shoreline or could see the bay. So we could tax a smaller set of people, but then we wouldn't raise as much money. The more people we tax, or the more parcels we tax, the more money we raise. Second, what kind of tax? Property tax, sales tax. You know, if you tax everyone equally, that's one way to do it. That's usually considered regressive because not everybody has the same ability to pay a tax. If you base it on wealth or proximity to the water, you get different kinds of results. And as I said, local property taxes require a 2/3 majority. There's a easier tax to pass in that you only need 50%, and that's for a sales tax. But then you can't specify what it goes to. It's for general local government purposes. And many areas in California, and especially the Bay Area, are at their limit of the local sales tax that they can have. How big a tax? How long would it last? You know, the polling told us that a sunset date was very important. For voters to create a new tax, they had to know it wasn't going to last forever. And the results vary depending on how long and how much we were proposing to tax them. Should we specify precisely which projects a tax would fund? That's tempting because then people know exactly what they're getting, and most open space or park funding measures are very specific about what people are going to get back in the way of benefits. But there's a problem with that, which is that this authority can't control when those projects are going to be ready to fund. This is just like a foundation. It's a source of funding that you created to fund projects. All those projects to actually restore Tidal Marsh are owned and operated by different agencies. They become ready or permitted at different times, and so that wouldn't really be in control of the funding agency, the sequencing and the timing. We did have the authority collect everybody's ideas for projects that would qualify for funding, could qualify for funding, and there's about 10 pages, which is great. They were projects in every county. You know, some of them were just pipe dreams, some of them were actually already permitted and just needed the money to them. And then finally, when to propose a tax. Our polling went up and down with the economy in terms of the level of support. Presidential general elections in California, usually the most people participate, the highest turnout, and the highest turnout of pro-tax voters. But those ballots are also very crowded, and because there are a lot of other measures on the ballot, state and local measures and candidates. Also, this is not cheap to do. Counties charge special districts for adding a measure to the ballot. And so in 9 counties, the first estimate we got was that it would cost $5 million just to put this measure on the ballot. And the authority, of course, didn't have any money. And local agencies and governments actually can't campaign, raise and spend money to campaign for measures they put on the ballot. You need to have a separate campaign to do that. So we figured it would cost $3 to $5 million to run a campaign in the Bay Area, in the whole 9 Bay Area counties. That's actually the low end of what it would cost. And it would cost more if there was opposition to it. So all these questions were debated extensively in public meetings with the governing board and a lot of stakeholders. And in 2014, the authority came very close to putting a measure on the ballot, but a few people thought it was a bad time, and we hadn't raised any campaign money, so we decided to wait. So while the Restoration Authority was thinking about all those questions, we were also trying to think ahead about how to build the most possible public support in a campaign, and especially build support and interest among the business community. Because if you're going to try to win 2/3 of the vote, you need to have none of the people that could oppose it and put money behind their opposition oppose it. So the best way is to get them to support it. And hopefully to provide some funding support. You know, there's a lot of wealth in the Bay Area, including a lot of wealthy companies. And if they all contributed, or some of them contributed a little bit of money, we would actually be able to raise that $35 million for the campaign. So one of the approaches we took to building support was to identify all the infrastructure that's at risk from flooding from sea level rise. Now, voters do not care about flooding. We tried asking the question every different possible way. Nobody thinks they're at risk of flooding in the Bay Area, even if they are, even if they've been flooded. It doesn't happen very often, out of sight, out of mind. And climate change doesn't just threaten flooding from sea level rise, but upstream and along streams from more frequent extreme storms, downpours. And that flood risk is not just an economic threat to the people who live in the areas that get flooded, because there's a lot of shared infrastructure in these areas. So if the approach to the Dumbarton Bridge is flooded, then it doesn't matter, again, whether you live in Walnut Creek or Saratoga, if you're trying to get from one to the other and use the Dumbarton Bridge, you can't use it if it's flooded. So that shared infrastructure includes roads, railroads, airports, electrical grids, server farms, water supply systems, sewage treatment systems. So if there's a big flood, then it threatens mobility, it threatens commerce, continuity of business. And so we got the Bay Area Council, which is sort of the chamber of commerce of the biggest companies in the Bay Area, to produce a report to try to, again, quantify what this risk is of flooding, and also show how wetland restoration could possibly reduce the risk of flooding in some areas where wetlands can be restored, sort of green infrastructure. So they produced a report called Surviving the Storm. They modeled an extreme storm event that we've actually had in California. The most famous one was in 1862, the Great Flood of 1862. The entire Central Valley was a lake for about 3 weeks. And it was because of essentially an El Nino atmospheric river. So the modeling here, and if that coincided with seasonal high tides, king tides, then the flooding at the shoreline would be worse and the flooding upstream would be worse. So the study modeled 12 inches of rain over 4 to 7 days. That would result in elevated creek and river flows for a week. If there were a high tide, there would be even more flooding. And there's 355,000 residents and 4.62 billion of infrastructure just in these areas that would likely flood in that kind of a storm. And the summary of the damages, this is making some assumptions about how many days people would be able to get to work, etc. Total is about $10 billion for this particular storm, and that's actually not the worst storm that could be imagined. And this $10 billion does not include the loss of life or repair costs for highways or airports, flood damage to communication facilities, PG&E transformers that got blown out and have to be replaced. And it also doesn't count if there's a catastrophic levee failure in the delta, which would affect the water supply for a lot of people in the Bay Area. And this doesn't count sea level rise in 10, 20, or 30 years from now. So the report recommended developing, some regional strategies to deal with this. Recommended a lot of stuff that's probably never going to happen, but it also recommended supporting funding for the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority to restore these wetlands faster so that we can have better shoreline protection from the wetland restoration in the areas where there's an opportunity to restore those wetlands. Maybe even more important, because this was done by a business association and their audience was other businesses, it kind of put this issue on the map for them. For precisely the people that we didn't want to have impose the tax, and for the people and businesses that we wanted to have support the campaign. So this is the measure that eventually got put on the ballot. On the right is a map that shows some of those 10 pages of projects that I said they collected and identified. So it shows where the benefits would be. And on the left, so this was on the June ballot, $12 per parcel. Raised $500 million to raise $500 million over 20 years for the Restoration Authority that would spend the money in project grants. Really, 4 years before this was on the ballot, while all these questions were being asked, we assembled a set of business and philanthropy leaders and environmental leaders to start talking about how we would run the campaign. And this became a really crucial, safe setting. It wasn't a public meeting that had to be noticed, for people to hash out all these difficult questions, and also for people to take their preconceived notions about how this should work or the best way to do it, and be challenged by experts that we brought in, experts in polling, experts in campaigning, legal experts, because people had a lot of wrong notions about how this stuff works and how you convince people to support something like this. I want to stress that what we were proposing here was unprecedented. It's very rare for a tax to be proposed in more than one city or more than one county, unless it's at the whole state level. And there's really no history in the Bay Area of 9 counties voting together on something. That's not quite true. There was the state legislature proposed raising the bridge tolls on the bridges in the Bay Area to pay for seismic retrofit. So the Bay Area did vote whether to raise the bridge tolls by $1 and how to spend that money in 2002, I think. But they were mostly proposing how to spend somebody else's $1 extra of bridge toll money, so it wasn't quite the same thing. And that passed by a huge margin because all the construction companies spent a lot of money to do this, and most people don't cross the bridges very often, so they didn't think it was that one with, I think, 80%. But other than that, this was unprecedented. Nobody had ever tried it. And so the great thing about $12 per parcel is it's not very much. It's really a tiny tax. The bad thing about it is it's $12 per parcel no matter how much the parcel is worth. It's a regressive tax, so that's a potential attack point. And renters, of course, pay nothing, at least not directly, because they don't own the parcel. The other thing, the reason I put this project map up here is to just underscore the point I made before. This measure did not actually specify which projects would get funded. It specified categories, examples of projects. There is a requirement for the spending to be distributed regionally, not equally, regionally, sub-regionally, not equally by county, but to make sure that it wasn't all spent in Santa Clara County, for example. So we chose to place the measure on the June ballot, even though we expected we'd have lower turnout than the November ballot this year, because there were far fewer measures on the ballot. And we knew that our limited campaign advertising dollars would go farther if there was less noise and less competition. We also thought it would be easier to raise money if we weren't trying to do it at the same time that all those other campaigns were trying to raise money. And we had a couple of key partners that were focused on supporting and running and raising funds for different measures on the November ballot, so we didn't want their attention to be to the core group of supporters, campaign leaders, which was primarily Save the Bay Area Council, Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We added some of these other crucial supporters, organized labor, other environmental groups, a lot of local government. We hired a campaign manager that had extensive experience running parcel tax campaigns in the Bay Area. We secured 2,000 endorsements from organizations, elected officials at every level of government, from Jerry Brown on down, through the members of Congress, mayors, leading businesses like Facebook, Google, and PG&E, and every newspaper in the region. And we ran a very lean campaign where we only raised $3 million. We wanted to raise more. We had some field organizers on the ground. We did a lot of online advertising and some mail. And I want to show you now, without much of an introduction, let's see. Is a 30-second campaign commercial. Turn on so we can see how it sounds.
San Francisco Bay is the heart of this place we call home. On our way to work, when we play at parks, or taking the view, today it needs our help. Measure AA to protect the bay from pollution, restore wetlands, and expand shoreline parks, so the bay will be clean and healthy for our children and grandchildren. It's our home, our heart. Our bay! At the bottom of the ballot, vote yes on Measure AA.
One more time.
San Francisco Bay is the heart of this place we call home. On our way to work, when we play at parks, or take in the view, today it needs our help. Measure AA will protect the bay from pollution, restore wetlands, and expand shoreline parks, so the bay will be clean and healthy for our children and grandchildren. It's our home, our heart. Our bay! At the bottom of the ballot, vote yes on Measure AA.
We got some fans here.
Well, so let's see. So the reason I wanted to show you that, we could go back and microanalyze that. That's like whatever, 5 years of focus groups, polling, campaign professionals, but that didn't say anything about the $12, right? It didn't say anything about where the projects are. Restore wetlands was about as close as it got to what the measure actually does. Yeah, some smiley, happy faces. Did you notice the scientist in there validating this is science? Clean. Kids, right? Lots of different colors of people. So there's some science behind this. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this is we did a very small ad buy, but people thought we did a very big ad buy because there weren't any other political commercials. I got a call from somebody saying, how could you afford to advertise during the Warriors playoff game? And we didn't, we couldn't, but we advertised right before the Warriors playoff game. And everybody was watching, waiting for the Warriors playoff, so a lot of people saw it. So I wanted to show that because can do all the substantive work that you need to do, all the legal work that you need to do. In the end, to convince people to vote for something, and that may not seem like it's very directly related to details. Actually, I probably don't need to make that point. It just come out of a presidential campaign. There was a fair amount of that. So here are the results. Very bottom right-hand corner, you can see that 70.32% of Bay Area voters voted for this. This is divided up by county, and you can see that some counties, especially Solano and Napa and Sonoma, which have fewer people in them, did not vote by more than 2/3. But we had the power to put it on the ballot in a way that it was the combined vote of the 9 counties and not each county. But going back to the point I made earlier, you can see why some people might have thought, well, let's not even do Napa County. Let's not do Solano County. But we also got the parcels that are now going to be taxed, even in counties that didn't vote by 2/3. The colors on the map, the brighter the green, actually the darker the green, the higher percentage in those precincts. So you can see what I said before. If the farther out you get, there is slightly lower support. But even most of those reds, I think, yeah, the reds are still above 50%. There's very few places where this got less than 50%. Okay, so this is my kind of sum up, and then we'll take questions. How do we win? First of all, we were asking people for money for something that they love. And that's what you could see tapped into in the commercials. People love the Bay. They don't know much about ecology or biology. They don't want to. Most of them are not birders. They don't know much about the chemistry of the Bay. They're not particularly worried about flooding. They want it to look nice. They want it to be there. They want it to be healthy. It's a big part of the ethos of the Bay Area. It's in the name. Not so different from Monterey Bay. How many people who live in the Monterey Bay Area actually go fishing, actually go surfing? Some, right? But not that many. So, enough on that point. Except to say that we tapped into that by using really positive communications to remind people, yeah, I really do love the Bay. This whole effort was ambitious. Like I said, the idea was first suggested to me by somebody in 2004. We did that case statement for the need in 2007. That only took about 2 years to write. So it was more than a decade long, and we kept the tax low so that even some skeptics and opponents were kind of disarmed. They didn't like the idea of the tax. It was pretty hard to argue against $1 a month for people who own a parcel in the Bay Area, where a parcel and what's on it is rarely worth less than $400,000 at minimum, usually a lot more. So the only opposition we had was from some anti-tax groups that oppose anything that's a tax. And, we aimed low because we had to get to 2/3. If we only had to get to 50%, we probably would have proposed 5 times that much. Our timing was perfect, actually. In June, the economy was hot, at least in the region. Unemployment was low. There were no national or global shocks. There wasn't even a particularly approximate in time shooting, the kind of thing that frees people and sometimes make them vote against tax or make them worry that a recession's coming. We didn't have any of that. The ballot was a lot less crowded. The campaign was a lot more visible. So our voice was really heard. And that $3 million we spent went a lot further than it would have in November when the presidential campaign was going on and over 17 state ballot measures and a lot of other stuff. We built a very broad coalition of supporters, including some who could have funded opposition to the measure if we hadn't recruited them to be supporters. As one example, Chevron. So if we had done a tax that was based on the value of property, Chevron actually owns the total property Chevron owns in the Bay Area is the highest value. And so if we had done $1 per 100,000 of property value, Chevron would have been paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, which they can certainly afford, but they wouldn't like a bit. And so that if we had structured the tax differently, they probably would have been an opponent. And they wouldn't have had to spend very much money to turn very many votes to prevent this from passing. As it was, we managed to recruit them as a quiet supporter, and they donated $50,000 to the campaign to help it pass for whatever reasons, their own reasons. So the $50,000 was nice, but actually wasn't as valuable as them not spending $50,000 to oppose it. We minimized the opposition, so the only opposition we had was actually quite weak. No elected official in the entire Bay Area at any level formally opposed this. There were a few who didn't actually endorse it, but nobody opposed it. There was no paid opposition to this measure. There were opposition ballot arguments in the ballot pamphlet from anti-tax groups. There was one, there were a few letters to the editor in the newspapers. There was one editorial about a week before, guest opinion piece from Clinton Kopp, who's a retired state senator in San Francisco, but it was late enough, it didn't really start. And we ran a very lean operation. We got a lot of in-kind support from groups mailing to their own members and doing their own promotion of this. And a lot of people contributed staff time and volunteers to help with fundraising and outreach and strategy. So in addition to the intended benefits of passing Measure AA, which is actually to accelerate some of this tidal marsh restoration that there otherwise wouldn't be enough money to do, those intended benefits are more wildlife habitat, cleaner water in the bay, better climate resilience for those areas that the wetlands are adjacent to. The other benefit is it really united the Bay Area in support of something that's a pretty massive local improvement for Bay health, for climate adaptation, for coastal adaptation and resilience. And it's exciting that the Bay Area is coming together to tackle at least one problem or seize one opportunity as a region, because we have a lot of other problems that are regional problems in the Bay Area that need some more regional approaches. Traffic and housing and education. These are not things that are easily solved city by city because they're regional-wide problems. So we've got a lot of interest in how to replicate this approach. Obviously not exactly, because this was a special situation. But the other benefit is that the campaign execution itself, I think, also is a model that can be replicated, and the relationships that were built among partners that now usually work together is definitely something to build on. And I also think that for constituency groups that rarely engage in ballot measures, it also is an education in the value of polling, of message research, deep investment in coalition building, that multi-year effort I described to get businesses engaged at a level that that would matter. And that's really, if you add all that up, it comes down to strategy. Having a strategy that isn't necessarily guaranteed to succeed, but is designed to succeed, and sticking with that strategy. And not being scared away from something because it's never been done before or seems impossible. Obviously, every region that's trying to do coastal adaptation doesn't have the same advantages, the same opportunities. Maybe some of them don't have the same challenges. For example, a huge amount of Puget Sound in Seattle is in one county. So they don't have the challenge we have of 9 counties and 100 cities. Every state's tax laws are different, so some people don't have this 2/3 majority requirement. On the other hand, not very many places have the progressive, wealthy population that we have in the Bay Area. And very few of them have Safe Bay, or something like us. But I will say that we never did anything like this before either. We had never run a ballot measure. We had never raised non-tax deductible campaign money, hard money. So a lot of new things for us. So I hope that some of the basic approaches and themes and elements of the Measure A campaign will give some other people ideas about how to, and just encourage them to try to tackle coastal adaptation funding, because I think the other thing that is common about a lot of these coastal adaptation challenges is there doesn't seem to be a funding source to do what needs to be done. Lots of other challenges, of course, private property versus public property, regulatory issues, knowledge gaps, general uncertainty, political resistance, but funding is a pretty common one. So I'm going to stop there. Happy to take questions on anything I said or anything I left out. I'm happy to call people unless you want to.
We go for it.
Yes.
So obviously, you said the importance of sort of having the public on board with all that was very important. And with the whole project, it kind of sounds like the marsh restoration was more, oh, it looks pretty and like it's more aesthetically pleasing rather than going the more climate adaptation route, especially with dealing with the public. Am I incorrect in saying that? Like, was there more of that push for climate change is an issue, sea level rise is an issue, or was it more to make it easier for people to be on board? We just went more for like the aesthetics of it.
So just to be clear, most of the public didn't know about this until they went to vote.
Okay.
I mean, a few of them knew about it a couple months before they went to vote. So it's interesting. We were pretty confident in what messages would work with the public, with the voters, because we had been polling and trying to ask that different ways and test things for years. The challenge is that to get the early political support, to build a campaign, to create a coalition, that requires convincing local elected officials, constituency leaders, and they have a different set of concerns. Some of them have more sophistication. Almost none of them know anything about wetland restoration. So, for example, county supervisors, when we started talking to them about this, they were very concerned that if you're going to propose a tax in my county, I want at least as much money as my people who live in my county are contributing to come back to projects in my county, right? That's not a concern of the general public. The general public wants the bay as a whole to be healthier. And they don't even get how wetland restoration is related to that, but if the right people are telling them, scientists, incredible somebody, they don't want to hear from elected officials as endorsers. They want to hear from them. So really for the public, for the voters, it's neither of those details.
Yeah.
And they want the bay to look pretty and be clean. If you ask them, do they want tidal marshes to look pretty and be clean, they tell you whatever. You tell me this is going to pay for taking areas that are not healthy and making them healthy, and that's going to make the bay healthier, and there might be more fish and seals. 2/3 of me will say yes.
So from what I could tell, the project is 1.4 billion, but the tax only brings in 500 million.
Yeah.
Where's the rest of the money going?
Yeah, so until November 8th, we had a big plan to take this coalition of powerful people, business leaders, elected officials, and sort of hand that to our elected officials in DC so they could say, hey, federal government, we should leverage our federal dollars by matching or partly matching. Yeah. So not so much, right? And you might remember that the case statement we did said we need more federal money, we need more state money, we need more local money. Well, we still need to ask for the federal money. We just are not going to put as much energy into trying to get it because it's really not going to happen. State money is more likely. So it's been quite a few years since there was a state park and resource bond that went before the voters. There probably will be one in 2018. And hopefully there'll be $100, $200 million or so in that to go to the Restoration Authority to add on to their total. The this money from the Measure A is gonna come in at like $25 million a year for 20 years. So, you know, that total was if all these different projects got fully, what we estimated it would take for them to get fully restored. Now, the total cost could be more over 50 years. If we get more of it started sooner, it should cost less. And actually, it should save some other money that doesn't show up on the balance sheet from cities that would otherwise have to build higher levees or seawalls without wetlands. That's tougher to calculate exactly how much in levee construction cost does a wetland in front of the levee save you. It depends a lot on other factors.
You talked about tolls, increasing the price of tolls, but is there any other sort of tourism factor that could have contributed to this fund?
Well, way back when we started, you know, we weren't just looking at taxes. We were looking at assessments, so you can do what's called a benefit assessment district. I will install streetlights on your street and that will increase the value of your property. And I will assess you based on the increase of the value of your property, I'm going to assess you that much. Those work really well for super local things, but it's very difficult to pass the legal test. It's a nexus test. And so we never claimed that this was going to increase people's property values throughout the whole Bay Area. Google's property value will go up when wetlands are built adjacent to their campus. Right? That was not a major message of the campaign. Reasons you understand. But we also look at other types of funding mechanisms, like you could do a hotel tax, a visitor tax, tolls. I mentioned the tolls as an example of where there has been a vote in the Bay Area, in more than one county. But that toll money was all for construction of roads, interchanges, transit, trails. So there was a nexus between the toll I'm paying to use this bridge and the transportation improvements. So we did not identify other ways of raising revenue from the public that seemed likely to succeed.
Is there a reason that the hotel tax didn't succeed, for example?
Well, we didn't try it, but generally the reason it doesn't succeed is because the hotels oppose it. And because cities are already adding taxes on hotels for other things that they can link to tourism. I don't know if it's true in Monterey, but it wouldn't be surprising me at all if the hotel bill includes 10% for local hotel tax, and that is going to, for these street repairs outside, right? Or for signage to show people how to get to the aquarium so they don't miss the tunnel, right? So there's other demands. There's no like free revenue source, and especially over the last 30 years in California, because property taxes that used to go to the state and then be distributed to local governments have been severely limited and restricted by Prop 13. Local governments have to try to raise taxes more for schools and everything else. So there's already a lot of demands from local governments and a lot of taxes from local governments. So that said, in the Bay Area in November, there were local housing bonds to raise money for affordable housing that were passed in 3 different counties. There were transportation bonds that were passed in 3 counties for hundreds of millions of dollars. So part of this, part of the thing that made this easier was that nobody else was proposing anything for the Bay. And one of the things that made it harder is that local governments are asking for taxes for all kinds of things all the time. So there's no like free opportunity to tax that nobody's ever thought of or tried. People have tried a lot.
She mentioned tourism, but that's like before the fact, like taxing tourism industry, right? But could you turn one of these areas into like a destination that would create revenue that you could put into the fund?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of good.
Also hard to do. because most of this property is actually federal property. It's part of a large wildlife refuge. Although we do charge people to enter national parks, right now we don't charge people to enter wildlife refuges. And some of the others are, other shoreline areas are city parks. Palo Alto, East Bay Regional Park District has some that are actual shoreline restoration areas. And a lot of people use them. It probably wouldn't be practical in most of those places to actually charge people an entry fee. But even if you did, the number of people that you would be asking to bear that cost is a tiny percentage of the Bay Area. And here we've captured a huge percentage of the Bay Area. Everybody basically, either directly because they own a parcel or indirectly if they're a renter because the owners are going to pass that cost of owning property and renting. So that's why it can be so small, because everybody's paying it. That's why it can be so small and still raise a lot of money. So if I charge somebody to park at the wildlife refuge to help pay the cost of restoring the wetland, I could charge them $10 to park for day use fee, but there probably would be a few hundred of them a week. It takes a long time to add up to the back.
So you mentioned that flooding is not really a good push to get people to come on support for something, but you did still pursue that. You still have the map showing sea level rise, inundation. What, I guess, two-part question, what avenue did you pursue in, as far as convincing those businesses as the background of trying to get that initial support? Was it flooding, and was this mapping showing what would be flooded, was that effective, or did you actually have to pursue other ways of, was it the hard numbers of what damages would be incurred, or?
Yeah, we tried all of that, because we had, as it turned out, we had a lot of time. I mean, I never wanted this to be 13 years of my life. So we tried taking that information to, through the business associations, to both public policy people who work for these companies and to the risk managers. So there's already a set of people who work for Google, whose job it is to make sure that if there's a power shortage or outage in the Bay Area, there's no power outage at Google. Right? So it's a continuity of business thing. And so we thought that would be the set of people who would also be interested that there might be a flood risk. If not to your property, then in enough of the Bay Area that your employees won't be able to get to work, and therefore you should be interested. And a few of them were, but not very many, because it's just not, it's a concern, but not a top of mind concern. It seems unlikely, and it is unlikely now. We tried at a high level by having some peer-to-peer conversations. And same kind of thing, like, great, go for it. I think that's good. I'm not particularly concerned. In the end, the companies and the individuals who gave money to support this campaign, which allowed us to convince 2/3 of the voters to vote for it, most of them were not moved by the substance. It's who was asking. The guy from Wells Fargo asks the guy from PG&E or whatever, right? And they're doing well, they can part with the money. If the company can't part with the money, then the C-suite people can part with the money. A few of them are actually really attuned to what's going on and motivated. Eric and Wendy Schmidt, good example. They do a lot of funding on coastal issues, on marine issues. We had never received a dime from them. I actually asked them in a cold call, essentially, and was shocked and made $250,000 to the campaign. I mean, that happens. PG&E gave $250,000. They thought they were going to get some huge, green cred. They held a press conference and stuff. Most people only care that PG&E, their bills going up or down. So, I do want to say that there's higher awareness of sea level rise and climate change in the Bay Area than in most places, and it's rising. There is an ability to understand the connection here, but it's just not top of mind for most people. It's not even second or third top of mind. So we tried really hard, and I think the success was getting the business people who are concerned about this and the city leaders who are concerned about this to understand that this measure is gonna help, and to get it passed, we need to talk about it in ways that are gonna make voters vote for it. And that's not talking about sea level rise and climate change. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
No, you're just scratching.
So now that the measure has been passed, and now it's time essentially to move forward and implement these projects, what's the next big challenge or obstacle that you foresee?
So, in the first few years, there actually are some projects that are ready to go, they just need money. Most of these projects have to cobble together money from multiple sources, and this will just be an additional source. So for the first few years, I think there'll be more demand for money than supply. But the next thing that is a hurdle to getting this work done quickly is actually that there are so many agencies involved in permitting these projects, and they each have different mandates and standards and interests. And some of them are really pretty effective at explaining what needs to be done, and others are really not. So that regulatory morass is the other thing that deters some projects from even trying. And the worst by far is the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not sure if that's a chuckle of recognition or surprise that I'm saying it out loud. There's a bunch of reasons for that, institutional reasons. It's a really bad agency. It doesn't mean there are bad people in it. But the biggest reason they're a problem, which very few people say out loud, but I will, is that the business model for the agency, the way they keep a lot of people employed, is by never finishing anything. Because you can't get a project, some of these projects done without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, and you also can't say, oh, you didn't meet your deadline, Army Corps of Engineers, we're moving on without you. Unless, as some projects I've done, you find a way to exclude them from the beginning. It's risky because you take on some risk, but some of these projects in the Bay Area have actually had less of a role for the Army Corps of Engineers. People wanted the Army Corps of Engineers involved in some of these projects because it's a source of funding for actually doing the project. But yeah, they're really not good. But going back.
So you got your money.
Well, the biggest problem with this, I have to say, from Save the Bay's perspective, is people think Save the Bay now has $500 million that we didn't have before. And I have 25 staff people on a $3 million a year budget, and I still have to go out and raise that money because we're not getting any of this money. But yes, we got the public agency.
So the San Francisco Bay Area Restoration Authority.
Yeah.
Right? So what is the vetting process for, say, that young woman coming to you and say, I have this great idea to help in the restoration of the bay. It's this parcel, okay? What is the vetting process and the money doling process? And lastly, are you firewall against people trying to poach on your money?
Yeah.
You are firewall?
Mm-hmm.
So no one can touch this money?
The state can't take this money, the local governments can't take this money. It belongs to the Restoration Authority.
Mm-hmm.
The statute that created the Restoration Authority is pretty clear that this can only be used for tidal marsh restoration costs and the levees that have to be built as part of a tidal marsh restoration, not levees that get built without tidal marsh, and public access, trails, access to tidal marsh projects, to go see them. So the statute's pretty limiting on what it can be spent for. The actual measure that went on the ballot further limits what it can be spent for because it has geographic distribution for how the money can be spent. And this doesn't change any of the other requirements, permitting and local approvals that a project needs anyway. So projects are going to proceed the same way they did before. This is just another funding source. Really, think of it like the Packard Foundation. They put out a request for proposals, they get requests back in, the staff ranks them based on how much benefit they're going to provide. That goes back to that points back to the statute. But if you haven't gotten all those other approvals, all the plans, all the permitting, all the design, you wouldn't be ready to come and get some of this money. This money can only be used for implementation. Actually, back to your question about what some of the other hurdles are. There is not a ton of money for planning and permitting and monitoring and all those early stage stuff. But at least creating this additional source of implementation money takes some of the pressure off of those funding sources that do exist for that. So, did I answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
It seems to me that the climate change, storm surge, invasion of the Bay argument did not win the argument.
Yeah.
I think the term that I wrote down and I circled, public affection for the Bay. I think that may have been that emotional connection to San Francisco Bay, where I'm from, okay, Marin and San Francisco, that emotion with that body of water standing in the Marin headlands on a moonlit night, okay?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and you saw that in the
No
commercial,
fog.
but here, it's even better than that. It's even better than that. So, we did some focus groups, and one of the places that we did them was Sunnyvale. And a bunch of the people in the focus group were windsurfers. So these people actually use the bay. But at the beginning of the focus group, when the person leading the focus group says, "What do you think of when I say San Francisco Bay? What do you think of?"
Me?
Yeah.
I don't know, I hear like
Where?
that song.
Okay. Sing on the dock of the bay. Where do you think of? In your mind, what do you picture in San Francisco Bay? Sorry, I should have taken this down. This is the main thing people think of. The second is Alcatraz, and the third is Fisherman's Wharf. Even the windsurfers in Sunnyvale. What do you think of when I say the bay? Oh, Fisherman's Wharf, Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz. Actually built environment. Even people who are using the bay. So my point is that you're right about what people love, but two other things. It's that image of the bay. It's pretty non-specific. And most people don't make a distinction when I ask you what do you think of when I say the bay. They think you're asking about the Bay Area. A lot of them, it's that incorporated in the idea of the region. They think you're asking about the area.
The built environment.
The built
Not the body of
environment,
water.
where we live, the 9 counties. Oh, I live in the Bay. Well, you don't live in the Bay, you live in the Bay Area. So that is a big thing that we had going for us, which has nothing to do with sea level rise or climate change or tidal marsh or fish or pelicans.
I'm from Wisconsin, and I got here, I met somebody from the Bay. I'm like, well, what bay are you talking about? There's lots of bays, you know.
Yeah, but if you live in Chicago and somebody says the lake, you know what lake they're talking about. But if you live in Wisconsin and you say the lake, there's 10,000. So it's a pretty special regional identity, and actually we struggle to find analogies in other places where that's analogous. You know, in New York, there's a huge affinity for Central Park, even for people who never go to Central Park and never use Central Park, and that's why the organization that raises money for Central Park and those other people, they do great, right? There's also not much park in New York, that's it, right? But there aren't that many places where there's a natural feature that is so central to the place. I mean, Madison, right? Mendota and Monona. But there aren't a lot of analogies, so we didn't have other examples or places to look to for how to do that. There's actually been a lot of really interesting public opinion research about Puget Sound and how to engage more people in the Seattle area to feel strongly about Puget Sound with an idea of doing something like this, some kind of funding mechanism for Puget Sound. So there are some places where there's some.
So maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Okay.
You mentioned you have some backlog of projects that just need some more funding. Do you have like a priority list of counting the ones that are at the lowest sea level first before they, that they get done before sea level overtakes them, if that's a concern at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for this restoration authority, this governing board, which I'm not on, is that it has a bunch of things like that to balance. There's what would be ecologically ideal, for sequencing. There's bang for buck. There's projects that are going to come in that have 90% of their funding, so that would be a good way, to close the gap, is to use a few $1 million from this. And then they want to keep an eye, even though this is going to go for 20 years, and they probably want to extend it before it runs out, or maybe even increase it. So they got to keep their eye on geographical distribution. There aren't very many places in San Francisco where there's tidal marsh restoration opportunity in San Francisco proper, but there are a few. It will be really good to get those going because San Francisco voted, like 84% for this, right? So that's a good problem for them to have, but they will have to balance that. And actually, I think back to what I said before, that they won't necessarily be able to control what's ready when. But one of the biggest projects that needs to be done, that should be early, is that accomplishes multiple benefits, is all the way down here. So, do you know that downtown San Jose is 8 feet below sea level? And the Guadalupe River that runs through San Jose, you have to go up to the levee to look down into the river. And there's a levee that needs to be raised up here because these ponds are all 10 feet below sea level, down near Alviso. These ponds should be restored first. And it's going to be a really expensive project because the Army Corps of Engineers is involved and because actually this levee does need to be raised quite a bit. Levi's Stadium, I think, is 6 feet below sea level, right next to one of the branches of Guadalupe Creek. So this is going to be a high priority, and it should be for ecological reasons, for sea level rise reasons, and it's going to be one of the more expensive ones. Okay, so I get 2 more. So raise your hand, and since nobody's asked me a question that I haven't asked before.
Okay, you're trying to restore the bay, so I'm just wondering, have you tapped into the business and industries that are actually using the bay to, for revenue, like shipping? Could you impose or attach some sort of toll tax for shipping going in and out of the bay? They're kind of attached to the whole.
So, yes, there actually already is a tax on the shipping industry that pays for oil spill preparedness, for example. So there's some taxes in place already. We did look at that, some kind of a use tax, especially for industries that are using the bay. Most of whom are taxed already they have to pay for the regulatory agency that's regulating them and other things. Again, to raise a significant amount of money, it has to be a really hefty tax because there aren't that many users, right? So that also did not come across as particularly attractive. And I would say none of those industries invested money in doing a campaign for this. I mean, Chevron again, they're right on the bay. They use shipping a lot for their refineries to deliver them. So again, it's a great idea and it doesn't generate very much money in the scheme of things, unless it's just being taxed really high and then it's hard to get an approval for businesses legitimately. Okay, last question, although I'm happy to stay after and answer.
So I get that you didn't sell this for, and there wasn't that much interest in its climate resilience or benefits, but were they calculated? Was there an actual attempt to try to understand what the contribution of these restored wetlands would be to avoided damage or anything like that?
So first, we did sell that as a benefit, just not to the voters.
To the businesses?
We sold it to the local elected officials, we sold it to the businesses, we tried as one of several things that we sold. We didn't sell to the voters because we wanted them to vote for it and that wasn't the way to do it. What you're talking about is an emerging science which you guys probably know way more about than I do, which is calculating ecosystem services and other benefits and actually quantifying what is an acre of restored marsh worth. So some aspects of that are starting to be better known, like the climate sequestration value of tidal marshes, of salt marsh, is high. It's 8 kilograms of carbon sequestration. These plants sequester carbon, and unlike freshwater marshes, where that plant material decomposes and releases methane, in a salt marsh environment, at least in bay salt marshes, it stays in the ground. It's 8 kilograms per square meter per year or something like that. So that's one benefit that can be calculated, although the California Climate Registry hasn't officially signed off on that. If they do, then it's possible that some sequestration, carbon sequestration money could go into that. Although the longevity of these marshes is tougher to ensure than, let's say, redwood trees.
Because of climate change.
Because of climate change,
Yeah.
right? Because if the marshes get drowned and they're no longer continuing to sequester carbon on an annual basis. As far as the flood protection value per acre of marsh, I think somebody else made that point, it's hard to generalize how much having, let's say, 500 feet of healthy tidal marsh in front of a levee that's protecting a city, how much flood protection value that provides versus the cost of a seawall and maintaining a seawall if you didn't have a tidal marsh in front. So I think there are some calculations of that, but they're very place specific. So that was a long way of saying no. We didn't calculate if we restore, let's say, not all 36,000 acres, but 15,000 acres with this $500 million, how much property protection will there be?
All right, well, Dave, if you could hang out, maybe some students could introduce
Yeah.
themselves and everything, and then we'll go out. So thanks again.